Hey, Egon.
Hey, Misha, what's going on?
This is the second time we're doing this, and we do it for you. But it's
Yes.
important that we make friends with one another because, Egon, you're back in town.
I'm back in town. I'm back in business, babe. Well, I'm not in any kind of business. I'm actually unemployed. And currently, if University of Chicago is watching this, you owe me money, and I want my money. Okay, so if you're watching this, whatever camera it is I'm supposed to be looking at, this message is for you. Pay me my fucking money. Okay.
I'm going to be on site pretty soon, and I can very quickly learn to make a
Flower.
Well, they do have that silly statue where they invented nuclear fission or whatever that looks like a
Mushroom.
which is my favorite part. But
Let's give them a lesson in symbolism.
yes. I'm sure they'll totally get the joke and totally be happy with us. Maybe they'll give us a scholarship. Who knows? So anyway, we're back. This is Text of the Matter. It's been a minute. Life has happened. I moved back from California, the great wasteland of America. I'm maybe convinced it's worse than Texas at this point. No offense to you, Texas. You're very beautiful, but I'm back. I'm back in Chicago, and that's really what matters to me right now.
Yeah, and, life is going on normally. Child, now.
Yes.
Let's get to Marx.
Yes. Okay. Let's get to Marx. We're going right over the baby talk. We're going right to Marx. Congratulate this guy in the comments. He's a proud dad, and that is actually an important good thing. And but anyway, we're gonna spare you the gory details and the poopy diapers, and we're gonna get right into our man, Mr. Karl Marx.
Okay, before you do anything else, hit the pause button and go search for Karl Marx on Google and find pictures of him. Go to image search and then go look for pictures of Santa Claus and then come back here and unpause the video and continue. I'll put a pause right here.
And we're going to be talking about a few things today. We're going to talk about our working day, which is very long. We're going to talk about the difference between relative and absolute surplus value. And we're going to make a bunch of fun little stops along the way. So this is kind of a fun part in Marx, I think. And so I'll just give you the first sentence of chapter 10, The Working Day, is: we began with the assumption that labor power is bought and sold at its value, which if you are a discerning reader, you might realize that perhaps this assumption we made that we were getting a fair shake for the value of our labor is maybe a bit misguided.
Yeah, absolutely. And as was, outlined in some earlier episodes we did and earlier in the book, the basic premise of capital is that a new relationship has been created, that we have become a sort of property, our own property, an individualized relationship where we sell our labor on a market and someone else
selling our
buys
time,
it.
right?
Selling our time, absolutely.
And I think we can all land on this conceit that's pretty obvious that, so Marx always talks about, so say it takes 6 hours for you to acquire your labor value, right? So maybe it takes you 6 hours to be a productive enough worker for you to essentially produce the value you need to live. And I think anyone can see that the capitalist isn't going to pay you in a zero-sum game, right? He's not going to just pay you for the time it takes for you to produce enough productive value that you can rent an apartment and buy food and take care of your children and stuff like this. He's going to want a little bit more, right? He's going to want more so he can make a profit too. And so this is the conceit that Marx starts the book off with, right? That you are being fairly traded for your labor time, and you're going to throw in a little bit more on the end because that's what makes it worthwhile for both parties.
Yes, and gets you beyond subsistence at an individual level, right? But the capitalist has far more concerns, right? At a purely technical level, they have all the machinery that they use and reuse and replace to produce whatever commodity it is that they are making. They have to pay the worker as well, and then they have to produce a surplus.
Yes.
And that surplus is something that is accumulated that goes back into the business in some ways, but mainly doesn't, right?
And, yeah, mainly lines their pockets.
And so, in that sense, that is where it is surplus. We can think about it in a more abstract and dynamic way, but Marx's point is more simple and directly to the point, which is that in our working day, there is a point at which we are producing a surplus of value for our boss, and we are not gaining anything for ourselves.
Right. And so basically Marx is very smartly makes this point that for the capitalist, for the owner of the capitalist enterprise, what they are concerned with is not the cost it takes for you to make your subsistence wage. They are not really concerned as much about the cost of upkeeping their means of production or renting or owning their factory or whatever it may be. What they are most acutely concerned with is the surplus value being produced by a worker in that day. And so kind of as we lay this out, right, like a working day can be a lot of things, right? So you can find working days of many different lengths, of 6 hours, of 8 hours, of 10 hours, of 12 hours. Like conceivably a human can work a 12-hour day and not die and not, and so the capitalist begins to concern themselves with this calculus of, how far can I push a worker, before it has negative results on their bottom line. And so,
and this is very important, right? Like,
yeah.
There is this basic presumption, right? This kind of automatic presumption that a person will work, they need to work. This is the contract that is made between the boss and the worker. But what's very interesting about the working day as a chapter is that it's not simply a theoretical description of the working day, but also a historical description of the working day. And one of the problems that the capitalist comes to, and what's interesting about what Egon said in particular, is that this discovery that we should not destroy the worker, because part of that reproduction of the means of production, as he would say, is not only replacing a broken down machine, a loom, a printing press, whatever, but also the worker themselves, right? And originally, as the industrial age is developing and the ideas of corporations and industry are first growing out of mercantilism, which we can get into later, the capitalist will drive the worker as much as they can for as long as they can for any type of person. And at some point they realize that, like he gives an example, in England, workers in a certain industry, I believe it was the silk industry, were dying in their 30s of heart attacks, right? And they had an increased amount of heart attacks. Well, they realized that before these people can have kids that are going to grow up to be silk workers like their father, right? They are not getting enough labor back to fill that work day,
to fill
right?
that need that the deceased workers are then leaving, right?
Yes. So they had to strike some balance, but often these balances are only created through law. And so that is another thing that we're going to have to look at, is how capital is and the conditions of the workday are implicitly determined by this mix of different structures, the structure of where you work, but also the rules around which it is determined.
Right. And so what we're going to find as part of this calculus, right, is that what we find is that the capitalist enterprise is sort of making these calculations where how far can we push a human being before that they fail? And they're making these calculations where it's like, you know, what is the max that we can push them where they still will have children? Those children will be healthy enough to then enter the workforce. But that calculation also starts entering with child labor as well, where, you know, if perhaps we are diminishing someone's life, a worker's life expectancy, well, can that be made up by forcing their children to enter the workforce at a younger and younger age?
And I was just going to add, and also, and Marx outlines this as well, detail-oriented things, like literally the needing of smaller hands, right? Like where can different phases of the production process be supplemented by children? Now, we must remember that this book was written in the 19th century. He's writing about a period in England that, and as well as in, he talks about Danubian principalities, talks about Russia. That is like running roughly from like 1800 to 1870, right? Or no, 1850.
Yeah.
Yeah. But and at this time, you know, you had people entering the workforce at 8 years old. And while the conditions have changed, I think it's important that we transform like what were the worst conditions of work and labor at that point to the worst conditions of labor at our point, and that we can find similarly how corporations now will still do this same practice just in new forms. And we'll get to we can get to analogies after we get to the literal points.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a pretty good introduction to kind of what we're going to be talking about. Now, you might be sitting at home being like, all right, well, what the hell does this have to do with the working day? And, you know, basically what Marx is surmising here is, we have to remember the time period we're thinking of. So all of a sudden, our working time has become a commodity that we are selling on the open market. Now, before this, most people were self-sufficient in one way or another. Maybe they were a cobbler, maybe they farmed. But the idea was basically you are in control of your kind of labor time, your labor production. You are producing enough to survive and maybe a little bit more to thrive. But when these working relations change and you are now entering the job market selling not a shoe, not a bushel of wheat,
Vegetables,
but you are selling your labor time, our calculus isn't quite as advanced as the capitalist. So a worker will agree for whatever is so kind of, as Marx would say, socially acceptable, socially determined. But this leaves the capitalist with the ability to dictate how much time that is worth. And so what the like worker won't know is the wage that they've bargained for, or more than likely actually just accepted. I don't think there was much negotiation going on here, except with pitchforks and shouts. But you have the capitalist wanting to exploit as much as possible from this relationship. So Marx always uses 6 hours as just a random base. But for the capitalist, after that initial 6 hours has been worked and the worker has earned what has been agreed upon, has produced this value through their time in the factory or whatever it is they're doing, anything in addition to that is basically free money for the capitalist. So if that worker works an 8-hour day, the capitalist has produced 2 hours work of, surplus value that goes back into the company and also goes back to their pockets. Now, if that same person is working a 10-hour day, that's 4 hours of sort of free labor. 12/6, you get the idea.
And what he outlines quite literally is that this can extend to 12, 15. Right. Like, there is the only limit to the working day is the day itself, right? It is that 24-hour limit, and then you can add in sleep, which can be taken from people if they want, and eating and things like that. But the working day, to go back to like the feudal examples, like maybe someone was self-subsistent, maybe a person was part of a guild, right? And their labor is determined by a set of internal laws that reject the ownership of labor by any mercantilist. So like,
right, and typically in the guilds they would limit the amount of people that can be underemployed, so thus sort of keeping things a little more even,
and also controlling the product so that like the mercantilist is buying the products from the guild, but they're not buying the labor so that they can take them off and do what they want, and then go and buy someone else who can do something else, right? And this is one of the fascinating aspects of what comes right before this moment in capitalism. But in all of these different facets, there isn't this organization, this collective determination that people will be going to work in an external place to produce a product that has no relation to their own life, right? So that when the person goes home, that part of their life has now been alienated from the working day. So the working day becomes this socially mediated unit by which the capitalist has access to that calculus, and by which they can measure.
The worker, of course, does not.
Yeah, exactly.
And is often and many times coerced, which is a word that is used in this translation a lot, into taking, if there's someone who has less means than him, who might work for a little bit less, all of a sudden the socially accepted mediated time is worth less. And so kind of the things we're bringing up really results in two aspects of focus by the capitalist. One, which is trying to find ways to extract more of the surplus value from the worker, either by making them work more, finding ways to, eliminating breaks, say, or shortening lunches or something like this.
And this aspect should be very familiar. Like, if you work at an Amazon factory, and they are directly timing the amount that you're walking, and like exactly how much time you spend in the lunchroom, and it's all being tracked on a sensor so that they can detract that exact amount of time, right? They are impeding on. So obviously we have regulations now that have transformed lunch, which they didn't, or dinner for them, that they didn't have at that time. But in the same way that the capitalists did then, as Marx lists, make lunch or make breakfast before work. So you had to show up before work to get your allotted breakfast, and show up after work to get your allotted dinner. Now they will take every opportunity they can to steal and extract any extra minutes to add on to that surplus time to create surplus value.
Right, and that could be as something as insidious as having the clocks at the factory be wrong. So you're expected to, maybe your workday is supposed to start at 8, but you're expected to show up at 7:30 to get your breakfast that your company is providing. But they set their clocks early, so maybe you show up at 7:30, you eat breakfast until 7:45, but they've got the clocks 15 minutes early. So all of a sudden they're extracting 15 extra minutes at the beginning of your day, because you better believe that by the time the end of the day rolls around, they're still not having a 15-minute,
like additional break
Right.
for you.
And so, but this is also, your Amazon example also reveals the other side, which is the capitalist wants their factory opened as long as possible, right? So, yeah, we can't make somebody work 24 hours, but maybe we can hire somebody to work the first 12 hours of the day and hire someone else to work the second 12 hours of the day. And you'll see this a lot today, right? Where I can't remember the exact thing, and if I find it, we'll throw it somewhere here in the YouTube video. But you know, there was like a New York Times article where it was for the eclipse that just happened. So we just had this cool solar eclipse that came through much of America, and the New York Times wrote an article about the lost productivity, or the how much money was lost by people like going outside to view this like beautiful cosmic event. But these aren't real losses. And so what Marx talks about in this section of Capital is how the capitalists will bemoan the lost money made by the factory closing down, say at 8 p.m. when people need to go home and eat dinner. Now, these aren't actual losses, but these are imagined losses by the capitalist, because the capitalist knows if they can keep their factory running for 24 hours, they're going to make twice as much money in a day than they would otherwise. And so, and I love this. So basically, you have Marx kind of identifying that he quotes this passage from some probably horribly boring piece of literature, Reports of the Inspectors of Factories for April 30th, 1860. But he quotes from it, "Moments are the elements of profit." And he talks about what he calls small thefts. So we started with this assumption that we are given fair value for our labor time. But, this is like the first evil of capitalism. And this is like why Marx is important, because he's like, well, no, the way that this system is set up, it incentivizes capitalists to find small moments throughout the day. They're not just trying to, like, it's not just a matter of like, oh, you're going to work 12 hours, which is like, right, like what unions fought for, sort of right around this time.
And some of the laws we can talk about in a second.
Yeah, and even laws that were happening in England and such at this time. But they realized very quickly that, if they can squeeze 15 extra minutes out of you during a day, say by having their lunchroom clock set differently to the factory clock, so you're actually working, your lunch is 15 minutes shorter, and so you're working those 15 minutes extra. What the capitalists find is, okay, say your factory is 300 people. Well, 300 people times, a quarter of an hour is, whatever that math is, extra profit for them every day. They're paying their workers the same amount, but they're acquiring this great amount of added surplus value by screwing you out of 15 minutes
so
of your lunch.
400 people get 50 hours of extra value.
Right.
Don't feel like doing the math for 300. But yes, and this coincides with, as Egon was alluding to, the development of the shift system, right? So these factories can be running all day, and the only worry about that from the capitalist is, well, when am I going to have to replace the machinery, or like how do I facilitate the amount of people that are going to be needed within the space? Relatively small concerns, but at the same time, the conditions within these factories are destroying the people, right? So what he's describing is that around 1833, we have in England the first factory law. And really, its essential function really doesn't have much to do with adult male work. It's largely limiting the capitalist right to work children full-time or women in certain conditions full-time, because what was happening is women were working in, I forget exactly what the type of labor, it was some type of knit work, but you had 20 women working under a single well thought of lady who were being worked so badly that they were essentially emotionally and physically falling apart. So the state tries to implement these 10-hour limits. But what the capitalist realizes is that this is very hard to track, right? That if you keep someone in one place, for instance, you keep someone on one job, yes, and even the government said this, they can send a regulator in to go and track how long a person is at one job. But if you take the child and they come in at 12 a.m. and they work 6 hours one place in one phase of the production process, and then you move them over to another phase of the production process, it's very hard to keep track of where every single person is moving. And this is a new complexity that is part of industrialization, right? That not only do you have a factory where a person, or let's say someone who's doing very specific work, they're a carpenter or an artist or something of that sort, right? Where they're at their home and they're individually doing the work by themselves. Now you have these collective spaces where there's many layers of dehumanization, right, and that they all are made faceless in this process. And that's not implicitly bad, but it is definitely bad in conditions where the boss has no concern over the worker. So the children become little hands that can function use the small gears, right, and are ultimately replaceable by other child labor. And as Marx outlines, there were 3 labor acts by 1847. England had enacted 3 different factory laws to stop all of the different machinations of these industrialists attempting to skirt around these regulations. And another fascinating aspect historically that he mentions is that while their avarice shows no bounds at an individual level, when it came to the advantages that they would gain over one another, the capitalist would suddenly the bourgeois would suddenly become extremely interested in the details of what this mill or that mill was doing to their workers, because that person had figured out some system to steal from others, and
because they want to emulate it. I mean, this is the whole thing.
Yeah,
right?
Or if they cannot emulate it, then they want it shut
right,
down.
and then they want controls put in place because they don't want to be outdone by their capitalist brothers. And so this is why Marx is saying things like capital therefore takes no account of the health and the length of life of the worker unless society forces it to do so, because it has no no reason to care about the worker's health, because it doesn't affect their final calculations at all. This is why Marx, especially when talking about this, likes to refer, he says this throughout the book, but that essentially the worker is nothing more than personified labor time, because we have to remember this. Misha, you're bringing up these great points about how they'll, take a 6-year-old child laborer, make them work 6 hours in the loom, and then they'll move them and they'll have them work 6 hours in, some other similar part of the factory, because it's hard for them to, for regulators to keep track of who's working where and how many hours. But the other thing you have to remember, because workers are just personified labor time, the bosses love nothing more than employing women and children in their factories, because labor time is a socially agreed upon value. During this time, it's socially agreed upon that women should obviously make less than men, and children obviously should make less than that. Yeah. So for an industrialist, a capitalist, there is nothing more enticing than working as many little cretins as you possibly can, because you have to pay them. Maybe you pay women half what you pay men. Well, you can pay those kids half of what you pay women. So for a quarter of the cost, you are still getting the exact same amount of productivity produced, because this is an industrialized society where it's not like, oh, well, men are stronger so they can, somehow produce more. No, this is all industrialized. I'm sure the children are making slightly less than, productivity than maybe their parents do, but it's a negligible amount.
Yeah.
And so...
And they also, and he's clear to point this out, and I'll just mention it again, they're doing things that are specific. They are brought in for specific roles that best suit the child. And therefore, their labor is essential to the production process. And in that way, even if theoretically, if things were larger and the adult hands could do it and they wouldn't have to take on that risk of the regulator, right? It might be the adult might be able to do more. It doesn't matter, because in the context of the actual production process, the child is the only one, or at least the only one that can easily do that labor, and therefore their labor is extremely valuable, right? This is why they continue to try to bring these children in, both for their cost, but also because of their function.
Well, that's what I was going to say. This is why you see this trend right now where places like Kentucky and yada yada, Florida, I'm sure, or whatever, where you see these like child labor laws enacted where they're like trying to make it easier to employ children under 16 or children under 14, and it's for these same reasons.
Yeah, they say it's for the families on the farms, but it's absolutely not.
Right. It's because they can pay children less than their adult counterparts, and children are much easier to exploit than an adult human, who has lived and maybe has more confidence in being able to disagree or fight back, where a children is still very used to being told what to do, and so it's much easier to exploit children than it is to exploit an adult. So you've got this like triple-headed monster where it's like they're responsible for a similar amount of productivity. They're paid like a quarter of what you would pay a normal worker, because it's socially acceptable to pay a child less than it is their father. And they're much more dismissive workers who are much less likely to, go on a factory revolt or, cause problems.
And one of the fascinating things that Marx points out is that the very concept of part-time labor was originally for the child.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Like, now we think of part-time labor as, you get to work half and you get less rights. You get less, you don't get health care. You're less likely to get various benefits. You don't accrue, time off in the same way, right? But that is part of a genealogy that goes back to children and their lack of rights working part-time under specific laws within England and other European countries as industry is exploding, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, we should see a continuous line there, and I wouldn't. This is getting a little post-structuralist of me, but there is this aspect of the infantilization of the part-timer, right? The unimportance of the part-timer, the replaceability of the part-timer, that in concept is continuous,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an argument to be made that like the gig economy, the gig worker, where it's like the enshrinement of part-time work, even though you might work a 10-hour day being an Uber driver or something, is the I can't say this word. The infantilization of the modern worker. I mean, it's the exact same premise, right? Because it's like, we've all worked shitty part-time jobs, right? And what's the big difference between part-time and full-time work? You don't get any benefits. Yeah. Right? And so
you get paid less in general.
You get paid less in general. And so for the capitalist, you are incentivized to hire part-time workers because you're not responsible for their pension or their health in this country, their health care, or maybe they don't earn paid time off hours the same way or at all. And and so this is what Marx is developing here, and obviously we're like sort of
Extrapolating,
this into like post-structuralist thought and contemporary society.
It's not. But it's not an abstraction from Marx. This is a real application of his thinking. Because we're still dealing with workdays, and yes, now with the internet and with the gig economy and with apps that are where you don't have your boss standing over you, but rather it's dictated to you through like one-time opportunities. If you work this much in an hour, you'll get this extra bonus, right? Because they need something at that time. They need to maximize the workday in that specific way by getting that amount of workers. What we will get to later when we talk about cooperation is that it's the same system. It's just that the internet has allowed for things that were limited by geography and limited by space to become unlimited by those things. But the same principles apply. And so to kind of switch directions to something that actually Egon and I were talking about earlier, but which is very fascinating, is that at this same time, you also have slave labor, right? And so
you're thinking about the American colonies at this point, and their reliance on, especially in the South, the reliance on enslaved people to make their industry work, right?
Yes, and like we all have our basic assumptions about slavery, and Marx even states it outright. What he says. The civilized horrors of overwork are grafted onto barbaric horrors of slavery and serfdom, right? Like, obviously, there is a barbarism that is part of slavery that is not the same in this new workday. However, he also says the Negro labor in the southern states of the American Union preserved a moderately patriarchal character as long as production was chiefly directed to the satisfaction of immediate local requirements. But in proportion as the export of cotton became a vital interest to those states, the overworking of the Negro, and sometimes the consumption of his life in 7 years of labor, became a factor in a calculated and calculating system. It was no longer a question of obtaining from him a certain quantity of useful products, but rather of the production of surplus value itself. The same is true of the corvée, which is a type of peasant in kind of like Eastern Europe,
kind of
Western
indentured
Asia.
Servant, serfdom kind of thing, very rudimentarily.
But the point that Marx is getting at with this description of patriarchal is that there becomes this concern, and he talks about it elsewhere, with the actual cost, because there was no selling of the labor of the slave, because they were actual property that had to be replaced. And I think you were making this point better than I could, but because of that, the slave owner was required to consider in their calculus this person's life and like how much it would cost to replace that life, right? But at the same time, there become new horrors, new forms of barbarism that are unique to industry that are quite different from the barbarism that faced the slave.
Right. Yeah, and I think basically the point that Marx is trying to make here, he's almost describing this like inception point of capitalism, where, at one point in the life of plantations and using slave labor to produce your goods, is that in some ways an enslaved person was property, and so therefore a tool, and so there was kind of this consideration where you don't want to ruin your tools, but then as cotton became this bumper export crop, there's sort of this moment where you're kind of talking about this patriarchal moment where it switches from something that you're obviously exploiting and obviously not treating well or as well as you would treat someone you employed on your farm or something, to having literal no care about this person's life, because it is more in your financial interest just to work them to death, because all they're doing is producing surplus value, because you're not paying for them to begin with.
Yes.
And, obviously in the production of large scale cotton production, they're, tabulating the cost of a human person, just as they're tabulating the cost of a plow or the seed or what have you. And so Marx really is identifying this kind of inception point where the calculus changes from, especially in England or something, where historically peasants were something that, it was almost seen like you were the steward of, much like we talk about land or something, where, you're not paying them, they're poor, they're dirty, you're totally exploiting them. But there is a part of you that was like, well, they're mine to take care of. And industrialism and capitalism introduces this inflection point where they cease to become this thing that you shepherd, but they solely become a commodity, much like seed is a commodity, much like, hay could be a commodity, where it is something to be consumed. And so you have a change in the way that the capitalist is treating his fellow human beings, because they cease to become fellow human beings. They solely are a
part of an insatiable appetite for fulfilling the needs of production.
A commodity to be consumed, and like any commodity to be consumed, you consume it, and you consume it fast, and you don't think twice about it. Right? Like
Marx says, if then the unnatural extension of the working day, which capital necessarily strives for in its unmeasured drive for self-valorization, for the realization of money as value and the meaning of the market and the truth of the market as real and actual to us, shortens the life of the individual worker and therefore the duration of his labor power, the forces used up have to be replaced more rapidly, and it will be more expensive to reproduce labor power. So labor power, the human, is reduced to a machine. As the machine becomes more integral to the system of production, the human becomes a machine that must be maintained. They become a product that must be maintained, or a commodity that must be maintained, rather. This is essential to creating the working day. So the working day is the framework, the time frame in which the human is mechanized, and then afterward, in their sort of alienated life outside, they get to subsist. Right. And this is the kind of dichotomy that's created.
Yeah, and so we're like, basically what we're talking about here is what, and we've talked about this in earlier episodes, is what Marx would call valorization. And so you have this moment where capitalists are figuring out how this system creates extra value that didn't exist in the previous system. And they're figuring out ways to maximize the amount of surplus value they can create. And so this kind of leads to the next sort of section, and they have two ways of doing this. They have what he calls the production of absolute surplus value and the production of relative surplus value.
And it's pretty interesting because at different points in this book, Marx ultimately says that they are both one and the same, and we're getting to a truly sort of Hegelian moment.
Yes, absolutely.
That they are both one and the same, but they all also must be necessarily distinguished. And absolute surplus value is like very much what you would think it is.
And that's kind of what we've been talking about.
Yes.
Like there is a day is an absolute, right? There's 24 hours in a day. There's really an absolute amount of time a human can work in a said day.
There's a certain amount of people that are working and producing value. And this all adds up to a total, right? And there you have absolute surplus value and all that is contained therein. In this sense, it is kind of the beginning point of the dialectic. It is the totality that is to be contradicted by, actual instances. And then you have variable surplus value, which is far more complex, and we're only going to get at like the edge of what variable surplus value contains. But I read a term that I think is important to understanding it, and that is living labor, right?
Okay.
That as part of this process of production and of commodification, labor is this thing that is in constant movement, that dies, that is reborn, that is part of this means of reproduction, right? And that in it are these fluctuations, these changes, right? So variable surplus value accounts for the shifts in the amount of money that a capitalist makes, such that maybe they spend more or less on their company, or they attempt to spend less on the worker, right? And what more generally Marx talks about is the devaluation of labor time, right?
Exactly. So like, I think we both like to be really clear when we talk about these weird kind of arcane abstract terms. But I think you said it perfectly, right? Like the production of absolute surplus value is what we've just been talking about. You're producing more surplus value by dealing with absolutes. So if you're supposed to work 8 hours a day, but I can somehow get you to work for 8.5 hours, but paying you the same money, that's how you're increasing your absolute surplus value. But there's also relative values in the process of industry. And one of those relative values is how much a worker is paid per hour, right? So like, you might make $45 an hour. I might make $25 an hour, right? There's a relativity there. And so, and we'll get into this much more, but I just want to introduce these concepts side by side first so we have a better understanding of what separates them. Is basically you have the capitalist trying to exploit the worker to get more value out of an agreed upon absolute term. So that's by like making someone work 8.5 hours when they've only agreed to work 8. But you can also produce more value in a relative way, which is, how do you make personified labor time worth less?
Yes.
And so, on the other hand, you also have capitalists engaging in what they call, the production of relative surplus value, which is this idea: if we are able to make our products cheaper, so through the industrialized process, through advancements in technology, if we can make the shoes that I sell that were costing $100 last year only cost $75 this year, well, I've devalued the product, and in doing so, I've also devalued the labor time it takes to make the product.
And this is, to Marx, the clear indication of where profit is actually made, right? Like, why? So he I always have trouble pronouncing this writer's name, Quinet. He talks about Quinet at the end of this. We'll go back to earlier parts in the section. But he says, Quinet used to torment his opponents with this question, and they would find no answer to it. You acknowledge, he says, that the more one can reduce expenses and cost of labor in the manufacture of industrial products without injury to production, the more advantageous is that reduction because it diminishes the price of the finished article, right? So, and no one could answer, why is this the case? It's because the way that value is created, and we will get into the reasons why when we talk about cooperation, but no one is making the money purely off of this valorized product of the capitalists would demand that you believe that, right? It's not that the Travis Scott Jordans are actually worth $1,200 or like, that's aftermarket, but like Nike's making new special Jordans that are going to be like $1,000, right?
Right. There's nothing inherent about them that's worth leather more than the normal
shoe,
Nike. Yeah.
than another Jordan, or maybe slightly more. But but what is valuable is that they can manipulate the cost, and this is something that Marx doesn't fully articulate, but he articulates in different ways, rather, or he fully articulates it, but in very specific ways, is that there's this, what's interesting about relative value is that there's this push and pull of both contracting the value of someone's labor, getting things to the lowest cost, making them more efficient, therefore lowering the price, and therefore, gaining more profit from that labor. But as we've seen in time, as the idea of scarcity, because at this time there's a pretty much direct correlation. The more efficient the work, the less the product will cost, right? And vice versa, the less efficient, the more it will cost because of scarcity. But now, because we can develop false scarcity, because corporations can develop this sense of desire through branding and through this extreme form of valorization, the capitalists can have both sides. They can have both this contracted value of labor, they can have this extended labor time, and they can have a maximally valuable product, which is really fascinating. There's obviously many mechanisms that make that possible, but for Marx, we should primarily think about this more basic form. Think of H&M. They reduce the production costs of their laborers. They hire teenagers to work at their stores. They produce cheap, easily replaceable goods, and that way they maximize value. Even though you would think they would want to sell the most expensive thing because they get the most money up front, but it doesn't work that way.
Like essentially, they're making the most money not by selling the most valuable goods, but actually by doing the opposite. They make the most money by selling the least valuable goods because the rate of profit that they can make on that is much higher.
And that's through the maximization of labor.
And so this is kind of like this great point of Marx where, he says absolute surplus value works the same for like a small business bakery as it does for a large factory, right? If you can get 15 minutes extra work from somebody, you're making a little bit more profit than you would otherwise. But the rate of that, added value, that added profit you're getting is very small compared to this relative surplus value. And and so it's like, it is weird, but it makes sense if you think about it, because basically what he's saying is, if you, by making your products cost less, it makes them less valuable, and it makes the labor that goes into them, into the making of them, less valuable as well. And so what's happening is, you're kind of, for the first time in history, things are being produced at such a scale
that becomes sensible as a mechanism of earning, right?
Right.
And what's very fascinating about like how he describes this is that like what's important about this and what prepares the whole system of the corporation and of the factory and of industry is that it is this great collection of people, right? It isn't an individual worker. It is a group of people working together to produce something. And therefore, to reduce the value of labor, you cannot simply just like say, oh, I'm just going to pay these people less here. That's not what he means, right? That is a manipulation of the workday in his description, right? Or extracting more efficiency. These things by themselves would not change, it would not contract labor value. But when you get to the level of the manipulation of law, of all of these things happening in tandem, of multiple corporations all working on processes of production and making it more and more efficient, getting more and more people to work in tandem, then you start having a larger structure which can push down the value of labor for individuals. And all of this time, the individual is just selling their labor as if they only have that choice, because really
they really only do have that choice, right?
Right. Like this is a massive shift in the way that people related to objects, the way that people related to themselves, the way that people live their lives. Right. And all of it is in service of the accumulation of capital, of value.
Yeah, and this is kind of one of the first sections where Marx really talks about the capitalists being the ones owning the means of production and no longer the workers, because it feeds into this. If you own the means of production, all of a sudden you're the one in control of, you know, these kinds of price disparities and values of commodities, and it eliminates the worker's ability to really sell their labor power in any kind of fair negotiation. So as far as relative surplus value is concerned, I think this small little section describes it pretty well by Marx. He says, you know, if we assume that the value of money is constant, he says an average social working day of 12 hours always produces the same new value, like $6. Mm-hmm. No matter how this sum may be a proportion between surplus value and wages, no matter how you're splitting up that $6 between how much you're paying your workers and how much you're making yourself as a capitalist. But if from a result of an increase in productivity, there is a fall in the value of the means of subsistence. So, you know, if shoes cost less, right, then the amount of money a worker needs to fulfill their needs becomes less, because all of a sudden the shoes they were paying $100 for are now $50. Well, you can justify paying them less money, right? Because they don't need as much money to continue their subsistence life. And so he says, yeah, so he's just saying kind of what I'm saying, you know, and so what happens in the labor process from this increase of productivity. Now, 10 hours were necessary for the reproduction of the value of the labor power, or like he says, for instance, maybe in this case, 10 hours were necessary for the reproduction of the value of the labor power. Now only 6 are required. 4 hours have been set free and then can be annexed to the domain of surplus labor. So he's saying, you know, all of a sudden, instead of gaining 15 minutes extra of value by like screwing with someone's brake, all of a sudden what the amount of time they're working for to get their subsistence, to get their value that they need to live their day-to-day life decreases. All of a sudden you're getting 4 extra hours of value being returned to you. And he says, capital therefore has an imminent drive and a constant tendency towards increasing the productivity of labor in order to cheapen commodities, and by cheapening commodities, to cheapen the worker himself. So if the things the worker needs in a day-to-day basis cost less, then arguably you can pay them less because they need less money to, to live. And it's kind of this weird circular thinking that's really scary. And
it's quite easy to imagine, and we can create parallels. Like, if you just imagine a time where very quickly, within 40 years, you're going from in your small town, going to the cobbler to make a specific pair of shoes that are made for your feet, that you plan to wear for an extended period of time, right? And that is the case for most of the things you own. And you're calling someone over to come fix your house, and you're growing your food, to being flooded with all of these objects and having all of your work represented by money, right? And you are spending that money. It would be impossible to extract yourself from that and to like make sense of what is my work really worth. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are these things that are on me, and like how do they relate to my life, right? And for the capitalists, it's irrelevant, because as long as they're out there producing this and there are people to buy it, right, they are gaining a surplus. And so their calculus has no relation to the actual living other than this idea of cheapening, right? And I think this gets into cooperation, because cooperation gives the details as to how, because cooperation is a fascinating chapter, a really cool chapter, because it both describes this system of manipulation, subversion, etc., but it also describes the ways in which humans can actually develop and actually produce good for themselves, right? The power of humans working in tandem.
Right.
So,
and there's also this kind of kernel, as we'll see, of, because the reason that we're sitting here reading Marx right now, it's not just because Marx was like this smart economist, but in all of Marx's work and writing, people call him a materialist, a dialectical materialist, which is like a fancy way to say that he's like taking Hegel's ideas and trying to make them actually correspond to real
history
intangible things.
An object.
But it's really easy to forget that Marx himself was an active participant in the sort of revolutionary cause and the fighting against capital. And in this, so he sort of lays out for us how, it's like capitalists can make money by like stealing 15 minutes of your labor, or by devaluing your labor and stealing a lot more time from you. But the only way they can do this is by bringing large groups of people together.
Yeah.
And, while he writes about this in a very like stodgy economical way, he's also always trying to tease out these points of dialectical materialism, where does that synthesis take place, where change can be produced, not just happen, but actually produced.
Yes, and where he concludes, and in this chapter, is that out of this process of like extraction of surplus value is where the concept of the labor force and a force of labor that is beyond the individual arises, right? Like, only under these conditions where all these people are pushed together can they actually work together and form something that can engage with with capital and with the capitalist at the level of decisions. Because before that, individual laborers conceiving themselves as individuals, just selling their labor by themselves
as an individual,
directly,
not as workers, right?
not as workers, have no idea how to manage, confront, rebel against that calculus, the complex calculus of the capitalist.
Right. And so people always, there's always confusion, like, oh, well, wasn't capitalism always like people were always trying to make a profit, or, these kind of like obtuse arguments of like, but he says it right here at the start of the chapter 13, which is cooperation. He goes, capitalist production only really begins when each individual capital simultaneously employs a comparatively large number of workers, and when, as a result, the labor process is carried out on an extensive scale and yields relatively large quantities of products. And so he's making a very important distinction that what capitalism is very much tied to industry, in that it is taking people away from their sort of individual lives, bringing them all together to create a large number of products, which is how you can do things like devalue commodities to thus devalue your labor, right? It's like if you run a company or like say you are in a band and you want to make t-shirts. Let me tell you, buying 50 or 100 t-shirts is like 5 times more expensive per shirt than buying like 1,000, right? Yeah. And this is kind of what he's talking about, that in this like great vast quantity, there can be a devaluation of both the commodity and the labor commodity, right?
And there are two moments that happen from beginning to a more complete form of capital. There is, at the beginning, the capitalist now able to access labor, right? And so this returns to the mercantilist example. He a little bit later describes that the mercantilist period is one where you have guilds. Say a guild leader has access to apprentices, and they are in charge of one specific thing, right? They are going to make all the anchors, right? And so if you are a merchant, you can come with all of your money and you can buy all the anchors you want. But because you can only buy the product, you cannot control the people, right? So the shift is that it begins with capital accumulating, gathering groups of workers together and forming industry. But where it codifies, where it becomes valorized, is when you have many different groups gathering many even larger groups of people to work in the factory, that it becomes, as we talked about before, a socially mediated concept where the workday is normalized, where the cost of work of an hourly wage becomes normalized, right? Like the idea that we have now of a universal minimum wage, right? Mm-hmm. This arbitrary number based on, national programs to find out what is the basic cost of living and what is half of that, right? And how much would that cost to corporations, right? That level of abstraction is only possible because the entire workforce is determined by this same logic. And because we all accept that our labor is this socially mediated product that is determined elsewhere.
Yeah. And you can see how this becomes a trap, right? Because when we all sort of enter the workforce and our time is being mediated to what, essentially subsistence, it removes your agency from being able to go back to, say, a guild system or to say, I'm a cobbler and I make and fix shoes, because not only have they taken your time because you're being employed for X amount of hours every day, but you're only being paid enough to continue living. So not only do you not have the money to buy the raw materials and set up shop and rent a place to make those shoes, but you no longer have the time to do it at all either, because the capitalist is trying to extract as much of your labor time as it possibly can for the cheapest amount of money. So you have this quick shift where people were used to sort of being their own boss. I make shoes, or I'm a farmer, or I am a weaver, or whatever your specialized sort of labor was, to engaging in a labor that anyone, even children in some cases, could do, and not having the ability or agency to be able to have a life where you are, say, your own boss, right? And it's and part of this is by bringing everyone into the workforce, because if only a small group of people are being paid for their time, and there's a much larger group who is
still
existing in trades, then there's ability to shift and become an apprentice or get out.
And in this regard, to comment on the time, right now, you may think, oh, well, I know somebody who, they make, lampshades.
Right.
And
sell it on Etsy.
And they
whatever,
sell
right?
it on Etsy, and they are able to subsist. But the point is, and we don't even have to get into how they must sell it through. Let's say they're just an old cobbler. There's a couple cobblers here in the neighborhood or surrounding neighborhoods that we're in currently, right? They do not have the power to affect the way that wage and life and work time is determined at large. Mm-hmm. At one point, they determined the way of life. Now, because these corporations determine so much of work, there is no option outside of that. The cobbler who is able to keep their storefront open is still paying their rent, right? They are still working certain hours so that they can get home and have dinner at this specific point, or taking this amount of time off, and they're functioning within these invisible, these virtual limitations that are entirely external to them.
And they're probably still only bringing home meager wages in return for all
Yes.
this work.
And
They have been subsumed into this totality, even though they look or maybe seem to operate a little bit differently, which
Yeah.
is why, like, this Etsy example, right? Which is often why we find that a lot of times these people, and this isn't even a judgment against them, they're actually subsidized by wealthy parents or some kind of life circumstances that prevented them from having to join the workforce initially in the first place.
Yeah.
But still, at the end of the day,
It's a matter of chance.
and are still really under the same auspices that the cobbler is, where they do maybe work longer than you or I do at our wage job, but still really only are able to eke out a very meager return because they can never compete with the capitalists, because they can't order the cloth in the same amount. They can't, there is no valorization in this process.
Yes. And this is a feature of capitalism as Marx describes it, but also a feature of human labor itself, right?
Yes.
And so this is one of his big parts when he's describing cooperation, which is that one cobbler by himself can never produce the same amount as 12 working in a room with advanced machinery, and they cannot produce the same as a giant factory line, right? This introduction of complexity, of phases, of the cooperation of laborers transforms the efficiency with which people can produce. It also allows for technological leaps. It also allows for, it has an emancipatory potential, but that emancipatory potential is quashed by the demands of the capitalists, because they are constantly trying to average this labor time. They're constantly trying to find its lowest mediated social value to keep people subsistent so that they can maximize their value. Like, he gives an example, right? Like, there are certain types of work that are tied to a specific time. For instance, farming is an easy one to think about.
So but harvest is his example, I believe.
But he uses an example of fishing for herring, right? And he says, when you have one person versus 12 people, or let's say 20 people or 200 people fishing for herring, right? It is not simply that it is multiplied by
200.
By 2. Yeah. It is multiplied exponentially, because this cooperative force allows them to do far more than any individual could do. The cooperation of people removes limits, both in that people become less tired. People are working in different phases of work and are doing multiple different conditions of the labor at one time. One person's throwing the reel out, one's reeling it in, one's capturing all the fish together, one's gutting them. Whatever it's required of it.
It's the whole fairy tale of industrialization, right? It's that, if I don't have to switch between tasks and switch my tools and switch. Maybe I'm standing up to do this one thing and I'm sitting down to do another thing. Eliminating all that sort of wasted time, we can accomplish a lot more quicker, because, one person making a pair of shoes from start to finish, that is going to take a lot longer than 10 people making a pair of shoes all in tandem, right?
Yeah. And he also brings in another element, which is competition, right? Mm-hmm. And here he talks about it in almost animalistic terms, right? That when humans are brought together to do something, because what he is very clear about to make a quick aside, here he talks about Edmund Burke, right? And so he says, Edmund Burke, the famous sophist and sycophant, goes so far as to make the following assertion, based on his practical observation as a farmer, that in so small a platoon as that of 5 farm laborers, all individual differences in the labor vanish, and that consequently any given 5 adult farm laborers taken together will do as much work in the same time as any other 5. He is not saying that. He's not saying that individuals are normalized into this this glob of labor. What he's saying is that once you get to a scale so beyond the individual that all of this labor is collecting and adding efficiencies and adding value and interacting with the machinery and the power of this industrialization, that things are possible on a scale that was absolutely different than what happened before. What Burke does is he is in a very abstract way. God, I'm forgetting my basic Marxist language. Reifying.
There you
he
go.
is reifying what is an actual real phenomenon. So he is taking the effect of this new transformation of labor and he is turning it into an actual feature of labor and of humans, that when they work as 5 people, they just become 5 people of power. No, there are differences and variabilities in efficiency between one factory and another. That's why they fight so hard against each other in competition. But at this scale, that competitive force is used to further make things more efficient because people are driven by one another.
Right. And I mean, you can use like a sports metaphor to kind of explain this really well. Like, obviously in sports, there are certain teams that are much better than other teams.
Absolutely.
So there is variance in the productivity, we'll call it, of any 12 people or any, like, you said 5, so we'll talk about basketball, right? Like in any starting lineup of 5 people versus another starting lineup. But at the end of the day, there is a kind of expectation for what that is worth, right?
Yeah.
There is variance, but there is an expectation for what a linebacker is worth versus a quarterback and these things. And then, of course, you add the competition element where you're literally letting these people against one another, where it's like, well, Bill can make... he can pick 10 bags of cotton in an hour and you can only pick 5. And sort of despite ourselves, we can't help but try and match one another.
Yeah.
And I think this really gets to why this idea of cooperation is really, really important. Not only in the way that it functions for the capitalist by being able to exploit the relative surplus value in things like, building 20 rooms for 20 different people to make shoes is way more expensive than building one giant room for 20 people to all make shoes together in. But also that the way we see ourselves as workers has to change. And he doesn't explicitly say that yet here in this chapter, but as workers, we can no longer consider ourselves as individuals. If we want any power, we have to see ourselves as the workforce, as a collective, and because that is what we've become. Absolutely. We are no longer, and I mean, you can see this every day even now. This is like the infighting on the left, right? It's like, oh, well, I'm right and you're wrong, or, I do get 10 bushels of cotton and he only gets 5. I should get paid more. When the capitalist, like Burke, says, well, really any 5 guys I put in here are going to do about the same.
Yes.
And our power...
There's a rough math to the calculus.
Right.
That allows for, greater generalization and therefore greater organization, right?
Right. And this is why, you we can't view ourselves as individuals in this context, that we can only see ourselves as a collective, which is why during this time in the 1860s is when you start to see the rise of the labor movement and of unionism. And of course, they're fighting for things like the 8-hour workday, which took in this country, God, fucking 75 years to actually accomplish. Even though we won it multiple times in the state of Illinois, it was just never enacted. But these advancements were only ever made by a collective effort of people working as a whole rather than individuals trying to make any gains. And this is a very interesting facet of capitalism, in that both our power as workers lies in the fact that we are a whole, and that if you get, everybody who works for a train company to not work that day, you have an incredible amount of power. But also, we have an incredible weakness, because since we are just one mass, the capitalists, who are kind of the individuals in this sort of scenario, can extract a lot of power from us.
And this is what is interesting about his conclusion of the chapter, because he recognizes that, like, to create the pyramids, right, that required a huge amount of cooperative labor, right, or aliens, if you want, but or like various productions, the Great Wall of China, like these incredible like totems of the ancient world, right? They are they use that same facility for cooperation, but the conditions have changed, the system has changed, the machinery and the process has changed, and the end has changed. And as well as the means, right? Mm-hmm. Like, a big part of cooperation is that it is a use of means. And in this case, we can talk about tools, machinery, like a personal relationship between two workers that work really well together, a group of workers that work well together, right? Like, all of these things are used to devalue, to make more efficient, and through that efficiency further devalue, lower cost, etc. And the result is a new labor force, but a new labor force that has not recognized itself.
Right. And so you're beginning to see the glimmers of what we all kind of know as dialectical materialism in this chapter here, where on one hand you have our greatest weakness, which is the fact that we have been abstracted to just socially accepted labor time as kind of this moment of weakness that makes us especially vulnerable to exploitation, while at the same time being the catalyst for a power that as individuals we do not have, that is inherent in workers as a collective to change society in the world. And I think it's really exemplified in this chapter in this really beautiful way, if you're really reading between the lines, where this same situation is both our downfall and the path for emancipation.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that pretty much concludes cooperation. So,
yeah.
And there isn't much more to add on to what you just said. What Marx decides to shift into is to kind of talk about the historical process and delineation and development of how humans themselves got to this point, right? And what ultimately destroyed the artisan, right?
Right. So
we've touched on many of these points, so we don't have to go over it too finely. But I think there are a couple important points to talk about. So Marx initially sets up that, humans were tied to their geography. They were tied to that which was around them. If you were living in North America, or you were living in Europe, or you were living in Africa, there were different crops that you were growing. or different animals that you were hunting. There may have been more hunting or more agriculture at this or that point. There may have been different minerals.
It's kind of like the gun germ steel argument where, Asia and Europe kind of have this advantage because they're all at the same latitude, so they share crops. And, something like South America or Africa or North America, the trade isn't the same. You're much more beholden to the context of your geography.
Yeah, and as in that, divisions of labor are determined locally. They're determined in even pre-feudal times,
right,
from the time of the hunter-gatherer, right?
When we need people for the herring fishing, right?
Yeah.
Or the herring run, right?
And this is going to be determined by gender, by age, by body type, by those elements of geography, by what is needed and what is going to be used, by the general population in total, right? Like a tribe versus a city-state somewhere else, right? Like these determine a new set of divisions within society, right? But those divisions still contained in many places this individual element of relationship to the world, and also different forms of collective relationship, though he doesn't say so explicitly, like, that were determined by religion,
right,
that were determined by spirituality, that were determined by
Zoroaster. Sorry.
Cthulhu. Yeah, the few guys like drinking absinthe and in the middle of this were like, nah, man, it's not capitalism, it's Cthulhu.
It's Cthulhu.
But so you have like the family unit, you have tribes, you have communities in contact, right? Like these are the elements that produce the way labor is divided. Whereas as the artisan is slowly pushed out of power as the determining character of labor, and it is changed to this new form, the division of labor is then transformed. And the division of labor is according to class.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we're like talking about with cooperation, all of a sudden there's a workforce. So, where a society in pre-capitalist times could be extremely stratified in the sense that there could be many levels of class and distinction and order, where you have the king and then you have the nobles and then you have the knights and then you have the whatever the guy who follows around the knights is called, and then you have the the merchant class, yeah, and then you have the peasants. You're seeing a consolidation where more people are joining the working class and less people are joining the elite, the ruling class, and there's far less sort of
stratification,
between these two extremes.
And we can think of it both horizontally and we can think of it vertically, right? Like Marx says here, the division of labor within society, and this is capitalist society, brings into contact independent producers of commodities who acknowledge no authority other than that of competition, of the coercion exerted by the pressure of their reciprocal interests, just as in the animal kingdom, the war of all against all more or less preserves the conditions of existence of every species, right? And he's talking about like this kind of animal conflict that propels these capitalist forces, but at the same time he's also describing that now you have these massive entities interacting with each other in very complex ways, that there is one factory for the shirts and the pants and the socks and the shoes and the hats, and there is another factory for every single thing that goes into your home, and there's the one for this form of transportation and that form of transportation, and that they all are interconnecting in this process, in this mess of competing interests, to maintain a certain standard so that the boss, so that the capitalist will continue to gain the surplus value. And these are the most variable and the most relative of relationships. But in total, they create this new absolute surplus value. And this is the way in which it's both meaningful to distinguish them, but also the way in which they are the same, right? That this mess is both this complex arrangement of new laws, technologies, forms, skills, conceptions of self, right? And then at the same time, it is a total market that is owned by a specific set of people who are extracting and exploiting value from the others. Relative value, relative surplus value, is an account of both how people are exploited, what specifically happens when this law is changed and these corporations then install these new machinery, as we were talking about with Amazon earlier, new sensors to track you. I was reading about Temu and their one bathroom that was like a mile away on their factory floor. I might be exaggerating a little bit, but not by much. And like all of these new imaginary systems to compel and determine work. Oh, I'm just going to hold my pee because I don't want to get clocked for having to walk like 20 minutes and to go to the bathroom. Yeah. But he says there is this a priori system of organized labor, right? One that is imminent to and immediate to the capitalist system, is determined by an a posteriori natural necessity to limit the producers, right?
Exactly.
That there is this necessary force, and it is often realized in law, but it's constantly this living labor that is reacting to how it is being manipulated, and we do not have much power in that living labor to do so.
Well, and it's like how you're saying, okay, there's a factory for hats and shirts and pants, and the more commodities we create, the more commodities we're then expected to consume.
Yes.
And actually the increase of the mass of these commodities actually makes us less powerful or less able to change our day-to-day realities because of the expectations of what needs to be consumed and the lack of ability we have to satisfy these needs by ourselves. And so we become dependent on a system that is exploiting us.
Yes.
Right.
And so just to really, I want to go back to an earlier section, just a little section.
Okay.
That I thought was really interesting to really kind of drive home this form of exploitation. So this is during legislation in the House of Commons in, I believe, the bill for 1844, right? And Marx says, according to the anthropology of capitalists, the age of childhood ended at 10, or at the outside, 11. The nearer the deadline approached for the full implementation of the Factory Act, the fatal year of 1836, that was the year, the wilder became the rage of the mob of manufacturers. So we think of these concepts like childhood, right? Now we extend it to 18. Actually, arbitrary number, but that, or maybe some people would say, 18 teenage years are different, childhood is whatever. But the actual concept of childhood, as it was determined, these manufacturers were attempting to change it so that they could extract more child labor, because then, 12-year-olds fair game.
As we've described, it's very important for them to utilize this exploitation.
But what is interesting about it, and it appears again and again across concepts in these chapters, is how fixed the public, an alienated public, treats the concepts that are born out of production, when they are actually things that are fought for and are determined by this abstract calculus of the capitalists. And that, it's, I think it's very common in our political sphere where people seem like, either by tradition or by some imaginary structure or real structure like religion or whatever, to find some resistance to change. These things are baked into these. Many of these things are part of the sort of preceding morality and ethical systems that are born of the limits on our thinking and our behavior that are produced by capitalists, right? Like, if we go back to feudal times and there was a religious decree on what is right and wrong, that is pretty determinate, right? It's pretty clear. You know its source. But when many people have problems with trans people and they don't want them working in the labor force or whatever, that often comes from
not in my bathroom.
Yeah, not my yeah.
There's an NIMBY for you.
It comes from an earlier form of like the patriarchal system of the labor force, which in its socially mediated form valued the man in a different way, right? Like the way that we relate to other people, the way that we think of them, the way that we think of people who don't work, the way that we think of people who worked certain jobs, or any number of factors are constantly determined by these imaginary limits. And when the corporations decide that they're going to change it because they want to exploit trans people in the labor force, they go and put on commercials and they feature a couple trans people, and it has nothing to do with the politics. There's no interest in the actual broad emancipation of this group of people. It's instead a subtle attempt to shift what you will find acceptable to work beside in cooperation to maximize your effort.
And to maximize their profit.
And maximize their profit.
And we'll see this more in the future as we continue. But again, this is section we're kind of scratching what is dialectical materialism. Kind of what you're bringing up is this thing where the mode of production has changed, but our social relations have not. And so there is this kind of antagonism that's built into this that the capitalists then exploit to further their profits. And so we'll get into this more later on in this book, as well as I think in the next section, really, we're going to be looking into technology and how this only amplifies this trajectory of the separation into classes between the ruling class and the working class, and the increase of the rate of this creation of surplus value that's going to happen. But this section really is the foundation upon which all of this happens, upon, as all the different references we brought up today that matter today. But this is where this is all coming from.
What you're really speaking to, and something that, is a limit, what one could read and see as a limit in Marx's analysis, is that he says, like, ultimately, what these corporations are limited by is geography and space, but really space, right?
Right.
That you can only make a factory so big. You can only fit so many people into the space, and that these provide like rough outlines for what at that time was the limit of the maximum capacity of production. But as we were talking about with the gig economy, as we were talking about with various other things affected by the internet, right? Where there's studies that show, people are more efficient when they work less, or a lot of people after COVID want to work at home, and their cooperation is being facilitated as people sit in their homes feeling like they are individuals, right? But in fact, all of this will go into the calculus of capitalism. Either you will have Elon Musk saying you all have to come in or get out because of some principle that he has, that he is attempting to valorize, right? As a harbinger of capitalist doctrine. Or it may be that the capitalists see that, okay, people will only work 6 hours or 7 hours and they'll only work 4 days a week, but they will get paid less.
Right.
And,
or they see it as an opportunity. It's something that I've experienced where, you want to talk about absolute surplus value creation. It's like, well, okay, if they work from home, all of a sudden your transportation limitations are gone. You don't need to commute an hour to and from work. So all of a sudden the expectation subtly and slowly becomes that instead of starting the day at 9 and ending it at 5, you're starting the day at 8 because, well, you're already at work.
Yeah.
And, maybe you're sipping your coffee and an email comes in and you're expected to answer it. And then all of a sudden they're stealing an hour at either end of the day that is punishment or payment for you not being in person.
And we can say the same. We can continue that with the invention of the cell phone.
Mm-hmm. Oh my God!
This idea that people take their work home, right? That now suddenly you're on call at midnight for your boss because they just came up with an idea and they want it facilitated now,
Mm-hmm.
or are bringing home computers that are repositories.
And they can contact you at any time because that's what it's for.
Yes. And
so don't, if you start a job and they give you that brand new spanking iPhone,
say fuck no.
Just know what the exploitation expectations are for that. Just know.
And even when there aren't there aren't clear outlines for the exploitation, right? We take a laptop home, and now suddenly the professor who was once writing things down and typing things out now has this whole digital system where all the papers are given to them immediately, and these new time frames are added in, and they have extra labor. No matter what, as long as we are within this capitalist system, and we will be until we break ourselves free of it, no matter what law we produce, a transformation in technology and means in the ability to produce greater cooperation at greater scale will always outflank that and create a new means of exploitation. And I think that's one of the things that is the core of what Marx is getting at.
I love that. That's a great ending point. I think that's exactly it. That is the crux of it, that we will always be outflanked because our social relations will it so.
Yes.
So it kind of as I like introducing poetry into these very not that Marx is super analytical, but I like introducing a little bit of art into these kind of philosophic discussions with these big words because it kind of, that acts as a counterweight. But I think, so there's this artist named Joe Pug. He has this song called Hymn 101. But I think these few sentences really sum up kind of what we've been talking about. And he goes, I've come to meet the legendary takers. I've only come to ask them for a lot. They say I come with less than I should rightfully possess. I say the more I buy, the more I'm bought. And the more I'm bought, the less I cost. And, to me, that's kind of a poetic and maybe not as clear but form of what Marx is talking about, that he is identifying in capitalism that its goal is to actually make worse products that are cheaper because that cheapens its workforce, and where that ends up, all the stuff that's taken away, it ends up in the capitalist pockets. And that is the game that we are playing. That is the game we are in, and we cannot hit reset. We just have to
fight through it.
Fight the boss. Fight the final boss, I guess.
So we're really happy to be back.
Yes, we
it's
are.
It's been a long time coming.
Didn't even fuck up the mics.
Oh, yeah. We have ideas for multiple episodes coming up, and including more Marx and Marx adjacent stuff. The plan is to go to Nietzsche after that, but for the foreseeable future, you're going to be stuck with, like, you know, the dude on the left.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's a problem.
Yeah.
And
Don't think about it as being stuck with Santa Claus. Think about it as being stuck with the revolutionary.
All right, now that you're back, you notice something very interesting about Karl Marx and Santa Claus? They look very similar, don't they? And you might think, oh, that's just a coincidence. But think about this. Have you ever seen Karl Marx and Santa Claus at the same place at the same time? You haven't, have you? Think about it.
yeah, absolutely. And we thank you all for watching. Please check us out on other socials. We have our Patreon, of course. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and see you next time.
Till next time. Bye.
Bye.
And I've come to meet the legendary takers. I've only come to ask them for a lot. Or they say I come with less than I should rightfully possess. I say the more I buy, the more I'm bought. And the more I'm bought, the less I cost. And I've come to take their servants and their